Okay, I'm very pleased to be joined by Ian Urbina, who is a reporter at large for The New Yorker, and he is here to discuss his new article, The Secret of Prisons That Keep Migrants Out of Europe. Ian, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to start by asking if you could describe the prison that is at the center of your story. What is it? Who is there? What are the conditions like? Because I think it's important in driving home the humanitarian stakes in play here.
So the prison at the center of the story is called Al-Mabani. In Arabic, that means the buildings. It's a pretty recently built or reconstructed depot, and it's in Tripoli, Libya. It's managed and policed by a militia in Libya, and its purpose is to house migrants that are largely caught on the water trying to make it to Europe and returned to shore by the Libyan Coast Guard. And then they're detained in one of these 12 to 15 prisons. And Al-Mabani is the biggest and the most notorious.
And what's the scale of people that you guys can determine might pass through there?
Well, on typical days, you're probably looking at 1,000 to 2,000 people in Al-Mabani. There has been a huge uptick in the migrants there because in October, a bunch of militias went to the main migrant slum in Tripoli called Gargaresh and rounded up nearly everyone there, about 6,000, 7,000 people. And the vast majority of those people ended up being taken to Mabani. And the overcrowding was so severe, bad things began to happen. And ultimately, the guards opened fire on the migrants, ostensibly to prevent them from escaping, and several were killed.
And what about the other day-to-day conditions that you detail here? I mean, it sounds almost like borderline concentration camp conditions.
The conditions are pretty awful. I mean, so bad. Look, there have been 6 to, half dozen to a dozen deep reports over the last 5 years from Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the UN, detailing extortion, rape, murder, torture in these facilities. The hygienic conditions are awful. The overcrowding is severe. That was really bad before COVID with TB and other issues. Got even worse with COVID. Severe malnutrition because what food does make it in tends to be non-dietary, so not vegetables, no fruit. And the migrants themselves, aside from the violence they face, there's a pattern of sale of the migrants for forced labor. That labor is typically women being sold into prostitution of some sort, or more often men being sold for agricultural work or construction work, or even sometimes for military-related work, for militias stacking arms or doing things in conflict zones. So all this adds up to the reason why the UN, said that crimes against humanity were occurring in these facilities.
And where did most of the migrants come from who end up in these facilities?
The migration waves started, there's always been migration, but the uptick began 2010, 2015. You saw a climax of migrants crossing the Mediterranean to the tune of 500,000 migrants. Early waves of migrants, many of them were coming from the Middle East, from conflict zones in the Middle East. Later waves, i.e. more recent to now, are sub-Saharan and West African migrants. And those migrants are, to a large degree, fleeing poverty, climate crisis, and also conflict.
So I'm just curious, before we get into some of the policy ramifications of this and the role of Europe and other Western powers, how did this get your attention? Because there's a story, an amazing story of how you reported this that we can get to, but just what grabbed your attention about this particular story?
So I left the New York Times after 17 years and opened or created a nonprofit journalism organization kind of in a ProPublica model. It's called the Outlaw Ocean Project, based on a book I wrote, and it focuses on human rights and environmental abuses at sea. And probably the biggest story I didn't do in the book was the Mediterranean crisis.
Yeah.
Because if you're going to do lawlessness at sea, the notion of tens of thousands of people crossing the Mediterranean seems like a pretty important story. But I couldn't figure out a way to do it. I then so I put out the book, and then I figured I wanted to do something, and so I went and did a piece for the Atlantic, where I got on one of these quarantine ships, which are huge cruise ships that the Italian government uses to house about 10,000 migrants to prevent them from getting on shore. And the stories I heard from those migrants were mind-boggling, about what happened to them when they launched from Libya. So at that point, I decided, yeah, I really got to get to Libya if I'm going to tell the story. So I went there with that goal.
So in terms of why this is happening and how it interacts with, governments beyond the absence of one in Libya, what is the role of the EU and European countries in either directly subsidizing these kinds of camps, or at least tacitly kind of encouraging the type of immigration policies that can lead to these kinds of abuses?
I mean, forgive me if I go metaphoric and meta, but I think the way to, at least I think, to think about this is you have a war on migration, an EU-led war on migration. I'm not saying the EU is at war with migrants, but they are battling the challenge of migration. And it is like a war. And in that war, the EU has sort of three, if you will, metaphorically, military forces: an air force, a navy, and an army. The air force is Frontex. Frontex is the border agency that for the EU. And Frontex puts the planes and the drones over the Mediterranean. And their job is to 24/7 monitor the Mediterranean and spot and report the locational specifics of any migrant vessels trying to cross. Those details get reported to Italy and Greece, and that gets handed over to the Libyans. Okay, that's the Air Force. The Navy is the Libyan Coast Guard. The Libyan Coast Guard, most Coast Guards face away from the nation's coastline to protect a nation from foreign threats, external threats. Libyan Coast Guard is a different creature. It faces inward. It's funded and created and equipped and trained by the EU with the main purpose of stopping migrants from reaching Europe. And it's Libyan manned, and those boats face toward Libya, and they're trying to block migrants reaching, international waters and getting scooped up by Doctors Without Borders and these sorts. That's the Navy, if you will. And the Army, to push this metaphor, is what happens on land, those folks. And that's the gulag that is the detention system. That too is heavily, heavily funded by the EU. So the EU is really driving an agenda that serves itself and largely funding the three different parts of this overall campaign.
I guess part of what's striking is, even with a relatively strict migration policy, there's a more traditional or conventional model of refugee camps that have to meet certain international standards and have access for certain international bodies, and usually there's a heavy role for international NGOs to play there. I mean, how is it that this infrastructure is so unrecognizable? It's not and I don't want to say that the traditional one is great. The conditions in these refugee camps could be far better, but this is such an extreme version. I mean, how do you think that this kind of model got constructed?
Well, the first question is, why is it so distinct? And I think the answer to that is because Libya is a failed state.
Yeah.
So Libya, in many ways, is a country or a state in name only. And if you actually look at it, you've got two different governments in the north that don't recognize each other and don't get along, and they split the north. And then the south is an all-out war zone. And so most of the country, even the UN recognized government, is run by lots of competing militias. So you've got this insanely chaotic void that is barely held together. It's not unlike Somalia in some ways, but it's even worse. That creates the precondition for what you're wondering. How is this detention system so much worse? Well, because it's not run by a government that is accountable and electable, and that's the major reason.
And so what should the EU be doing differently? I mean, your main function here is to spotlight this, obviously, not to make policy recommendations, but when you walked away from this, because the quotes that were emailed to you by the kind of EU spokespeople basically acknowledge the problem, but don't really suggest much other than rhetoric about what to do about it. I mean, did you come away from this thinking about how things should be done differently?
I did. I mean, again, as a journalist, as you point out, you're meant to be a conduit, but you size up what stuff travels through you, and so you choose the sources that you think are more trustworthy. The sources that I think are sharp and convincing put forward two ideas. One is that the notion of outsourcing one of the most difficult problems that even the U.S. faces on the Mexican border and doesn't do well by. And the notion of outsourcing these problems by Western wealthy governments to failed states or challenged states, Libya and Mexico, is a patently bad idea, right? So what entities shouldn't be doing, be it the EU or the U.S., is outsourcing this duty to countries that are not equipped to do it in a way that's ethical or legal. What in EU's case specifically, what I hear from folks that seem to know what they're talking about is those three entities I described: the Air Force, the Navy, and the Army. If the EU wanted to pressure Libya to clean up its act when it comes to treatment within detention facilities, the way to do that is to squeeze the Libyan Coast Guard, and to squeeze it through financial means by saying, look, we're not going to give you the boats anymore and fix the boats and the training and all that stuff unless you can show that you've cleaned up conditions in the detention centers. That would be what I'm told is an achievable tactic, and one where there's actual leverage the EU could exert and might get some outcomes. What these folks also say is the notion of the EU pulling out of the detention centers entirely and pulling back their revenue from those is probably not a great idea, in the sense that what dollars do go into those detention centers are often to NGOs that are trying to do harm reduction, IOM, the UN Human Rights Agency and others. So just pulling their funding from the detention centers wouldn't make things better for the detainees. But squeezing the Libyan Coast Guard and the Libyan government to clean up their act and making it conditional on revenue might actually work.
And so you had this incredibly harrowing experience of you and your reporting team being detained for a period of days. Who do you think arrested you? I mean, as you said, it's kind of a failed state. There's not like a very central governing authority. When you were taken and being held, like who did you think was holding you?
Well, we know it was something called the Libyan Intelligence Service, if only because they told us, and we also signed papers on their letterhead, when we signed our written confessions in Arabic. The Libyan Intelligence Service is an arm of the UN-recognized federal government. It, like everything else, has a militia behind it. It's a militia called Al-Nawasi. There are two main militias and branches of this kind of secret police work in Libya, in Tripoli. And this is one branch that does counterterrorism, counterespionage work. And in their view, we were not just journalists, we were also spies. And we were there by reporting on the migrant issue, really with the agenda of destabilizing and besmirching the Libyan government. And so that was why they ultimately grabbed us up.
And what did you have doubts about whether you were going to get out? I mean, it sounded like, really harrowing scenes of, guns being waved and threats being made and, forced confessions being sought. I mean, did you have confidence you were going to get out of that situation?
No, not in the slightest. I mean, it was a Sunday night at 8 p.m. I was at the hotel. I had a team of three others. They went out with armed security to dinner. I was staying back because I had work to do, on the phone with my wife, knock on the hotel door. A dozen men, from what I could glance, come barging in, gun to head, put me on the floor, hood me, beat me, break a couple ribs, do kidney damage, and really work me over pretty good. Then drag me out barefoot through the hotel lobby, still hooded, put me in a car, take me to a secret prison. The three other reporters get hit in the middle of an intersection. by a very well orchestrated strike. The driver, armed driver of their car, gets pulled out, pistol whipped. The three of them get taken again, blindfolded, and they also end up at the secret prison. And we were held there in two of us in isolation cells, and then two were put together in a prison cell for 7 days, 6 days, I think it was, and hands down the scariest thing I've ever been through. And I thought that there was a good chance that we wouldn't make it out alive.
I mean, you're on a you've been a reporter for a long time. You're with a pretty substantial team. You clearly are engaged in reporting on something that's international news. I mean, do you think that this is a governing entity that receives money from the European Union, as we've discussed? Like, do you think that there's a brazenness to the risks that reporters is that a scene that is a signal of a world that is more hostile to journalism itself? Because it did feel like that was obviously a pretty extreme length for what is essentially a part of a government that receives international assistance to go to.
I don't know. I don't have a meta sense of what it might indicate about the mood toward journalism writ large. I do think it might not be representative. It might more be indicative of just how distinctly chaotic and unaccountable and dangerous Libya is. I think it's just more of that.
Yeah. Well, look, it's an extraordinary story, your own story, and the obviously the reporting you do and the story you tell. So thanks for doing that. And I think people need to, at the end of the day, I hope when people read these stories, they also recognize that these are, politicians are responding to public sentiment that is anti-immigrant, but that this is what it can lead to. So I think it's really important that you're shining a light on this, and thanks for joining us to shine a little more light today.
Thank you.